in particular. So great to see so many students. Obviously, we love our faculty and staff and our graduate students, but not as much as we love our undergraduates. So it's wonderful to see you all here. We're in for a treat today from one of the coolest guys in the profession, in the history profession. And I just want to start by saying it's kind of with a slight heavy heart to introduce him because he's the best distinguished visiting fellow of the Kinder Institute that never was. It was all lined up, and then there was complications linked to the thing we mustn't talk about, the pandemic and its ongoing reverberations. So Caton was unable to be here with us, at least at that time, for a proper semester. So he's here instead to give a lecture that I think he would have been giving during that visit. I should also say something else that's funny is that a couple of days ago, I was hanging out in Leicester, England, which is our visiting speaker's hometown, where he grew up. Meanwhile, at the exact same time earlier this week, where was he? He was hanging out in Abilene, Kansas, at the Eisenhower Library, which is within spitting distance, or as we say in Western Kansas, sherry throwing distance from where I grew up in Salina. So we were in one another's hometowns just a couple of days ago. How weird is that? Like, that's totally random. I haven't even said who he is yet. I'm telling all these personal things. This is Caton Mistry, professor at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom, an expert in 20th century American history, post-1945 foreign relations, international history. Many of you, I know, will know of his first book on Italy during the Cold War and U.S. Foreign policy, U.S. Political warfare, as he calls it, political warfare within Italy to bring Italy within the Western orbit and to take it to the Italian left. More recently, he has gotten into what he's going to talk about today, issues of national security, government secrecy, whistleblowing. He published a couple years ago with Hannah Gurman a really good volume. In fact, I'd say it's the starting point for the history of whistleblowing in the United States. The name of that one, through Columbia University Press, Whistleblowing Nation, The History of National Security Disclosures and the Cult of Secrecy, 2020. And I think out of that project is his current research interest that we're going to hear about today. The title of today's paper is Entrenched Secrecy, the Culture of National Security Secrets in Modern America. Let's give Caton Mistry a big, warm
Fantastic. Okay. Have I put this on correctly? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Jay, for that really generous introduction. And thank you all for coming out. It's a real pleasure to be here in a different universe. We've been here a little bit longer, but it's great to be here. It's great just to be traveling again. It's great to be outside of the UK at the moment. Our government is slowly disintegrated. So, yeah, it's great. Delighted to be here. And it's also quite fitting that we're here talking at the Kinder Institute on constitutional democracy, given the themes that we're talking about today, but also fitting that I'm here in this region. As Jay mentioned, I was at the Eisenhower Library earlier this week. And as I left, got in the car to drive over here, was driving on the I-70. There's a stretch which is the Eisenhower-Truman Presidential Memorial Highway. And it's quite fitting because these are two administrations that play a really important role in the story that I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm not going to start with the presidencies of the Midwest, but actually with a reference to the UK. And I know there's a lot of Anglophiles here, there's a couple of Brits as well. So I'm going to make a reference to a long-running BBC political satire show called Have I Got News for You? So some of you may be familiar with this, for those of you who are not, this is a long-running political satire, talks about contemporary affairs, politics, and one of the games they play on this show is the odd one out round. So we're going to have a little round of odd one out here. We're going to get the answers at the end, but I'm going to show you 4 images, and they're connected in a certain way, but one of the sort of protagonists here is the odd one out. So, our roll call. First, the New York Times. Secondly, former US Army General, former head of the CIA, David Petraeus. Third, former US Air Force National Security Agency translator Rhiannon Winner. And last but not least, Donald Trump. So, keep those in mind. Have a think about what could potentially unite these 4 characters, individuals, institutions, and one of them is the odd one out. So, I'm going to start though with a quote. Secrecy is a form of government. Okay, yes, here we go. Secrecy is a form of government regulation. Americans are familiar with the tendency to over-regulate in other areas. What's different with secrecy is that the public cannot know the extent or the content of the regulation. Now, this quote comes part of an unprecedented critique of government secrecy. It's not from a firebrand or a conspiracy theorist or someone who's seeking to overhaul the political system. But rather, it comes from the political mainstream, right smack bang middle of it, in the middle of it, from an archetypal establishment figure. And it's this chap here who is the author of that quote, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, long-term senator, politician, diplomat, esteemed scholar of sociology. Moynihan has a distinguished policymaking and legislative career. He serves under various presidents, under John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, Ford. He's the longest serving senator from New York. And this is a Democrat who regularly breaks from liberal positions, and many identify him as a charter member of the neoconservative movement in the 1970s. Okay, so this is a guy who's a friend to the national security and defense infrastructure, the services, the recipient of the CIA medal. And by the 1990s, Moynihan had become a surprisingly outspoken critic of state secrecy, especially their effect on American democracy. Moynihan leads a congressional inquiry that argues for a reduction in secrecy and more transparency. Excessive secrecy, I quote, has significant consequences for the national interest. This is what his committee concluded in 1997. This is a world where the US stands as the undisputed global force, and it was time to assert certain American fundamentals, foremost of which is the right to know what government is doing and the corresponding ability to judge its performance. So again, here we're talking about a heavyweight political figure, right, with all the credentials that you would want to bring about reform of secrecy. Okay. Moynihan's commission produces a raft of recommendations, however, none of them move the dial. None of them have any tangible impact on political or public discourse. Right. The attempt to, what he says, ensure a new way of thinking about government secrecy comes to naught. Now, secrecy is curious, given how it contradicts, like very few other concepts, many of the United States' most cherished values. Free society, freedom of speech, open government. The foundation and policing of state secrecy places arguably the greatest strain on core democratic principles. Now, of course, there's widespread acceptance that some secret information must be secured, and the recognition of this, of a need to balance between national security and freedom. However, there have been very few examinations of the state secrecy regime, especially those that consider why security habitually trumps liberty. Moynihan's was arguably the most prominent effort, that it had no telling impact was important, and was a telling testimony to the entrenchment of state secrets. So, where did this all-consuming system come from? How did state secrets become a permanent feature of modern American politics, culture, society? So the research that I'm doing, and which is part of the book, tackles a central question. Right? How the US goes from a system of government that prided itself on openness in the late 19th century to one with the largest organized secrecy regime in human history from the start of the 21st century. And this is a system that's made up of billions of classified documents, a hodgepodge of Byzantine rules, a lavishly funded national security infrastructure. Its size and reach are remarkable. Yet the curiously short history of secrecy is poorly understood. There's no comprehensive account of it. The existing literature is fairly piecemeal. It's spread over different disciplines and focus on particular aspects, periods, laws, or particular agencies. So this book that I'm working on explores the origins of the secrecy regime and traces its evolution over the long 20th century, especially how it responded to crises, to exposures and reform attempts, all to become stronger and seemingly impervious to change. So what I'm going to do today is to give an overview of the project. I'm going to be stopping to focus at a couple of points in the 1910s, 1950s, and also the 1970s, so a snapshot of certain key moments. And I think exploring this history speaks to that age-old question of balancing security and liberty in a democracy, and especially how the scales became perennially tilted toward the former. Now, few things are going to perk someone's interest more than uttering the phrase, "I have a secret." Whether that's in a professional setting or a personal setting, if you're out with your friends, if you're talking within a seminar room, upton faculty meetings would be far more interesting than someone introduces some information that shouldn't be known, right? The idea of restricted information that we're not supposed to know is fascinating. That which is withheld always seems to be more important. Indeed, the allure of secrecy, or secrets, is often more powerful than knowing it itself. And we're all drawn to them, right? Secrets are, of course, as old as time. They extend over all aspects of life, political, religious, science, trade. Between the 15th and the 18th century, Europe was marked by the age of secrecy. Secrets were used by political leaders, kings, by rulers as a shield to protect and also as a sword to attack. Now, secrets may be as old as time, but secrecy within bureaucracies is tied to the emergence of the nation state, right? And the political philosopher and sociologist Max Weber noted that secrets were inherent to bureaucracies. Each bureaucracy seeks to increase superiority of those on the inside by keeping knowledge and intentions secret. See many faculty members nodding here. The institutional secret is important, right? And it affects us all. This is a little disclaimer that my institution, the University of East Anglia, asks us all to put at the bottom of our emails, right? This email is confidential, may be privileged, blah, blah, blah. If you were to release it, it could be strictly prohibited, maybe unlawful. Please inform me that this message has gone straight before deleting it. Again, that key point, to reveal its contents, to do so may be strictly prohibited and may be unlawful. Now, the difference between this kind of secrecy and the sort of state secrecy that we're talking about here is that my institution, East Anglia, won't prosecute me, or at least I hope they wouldn't, for disseminating this sort of confidential information that comes in by emails. So what is a state secret? On a very basic level, it's any document stamped by an authorized official who deems the information within it as crucial to national security. Now, it covers a wide variety of items, from sensitive military security matters to confidential discussions between states to trivial and even personal material. Secrecy can censor anything from nuclear codes to the topping from governments to legal activities to simply embarrassing private information. In short, a secret is anything that someone with a stamp classifies. So we often think of the document, right? Document, the redacted document, or maybe with an archive. when we talk about secrets. But the modern state secrecy regime is actually multifaceted. It's made up of the classification system. It's made up of executive orders, of non-disclosure agreements, also known as secrecy agreements, right? Miscellaneous legislation, things that go back to the World War I era, like the Espionage Act, for example, right? And it involves the work of several executive agencies. Now, it's impossible to know the exact size and scale of the exact form of the secret state. After all, it's secret, right? But by any measure, it's enormous. So we've just got a couple of stats to give you a sort of sense of the size of it just in the last decade, right? Or the last couple of decades. In the early 1990s, the office that handles information security admitted to not knowing how much classified information existed. Quote, it's a huge mountain, perhaps billions. Right? Over the last decade alone, in 1 year, you have 95 million new classified documents created 1 year alone. This comes in 2012, in addition to what already exists. Right? You have almost 5 million Americans who require a security clearance to handle them. That's 2014. And the cost of protecting or protecting classified information was estimated to be in the region of $18 billion. 5 years ago. Okay. Then you have the activities of the security agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and other defense agencies that are routinely shielded from view. And you hear the phrase, can neither confirm nor deny, frequently cited by government officials to circumvent public scrutiny. And it's got to the stage where that phrase is almost is being used by the CIA itself. So the CIA, when it got on Twitter, the very first tweet that ever sent out was that we can see that, right? We can either confirm or deny that this is our first tweet. So the secrecy regime has grown exponentially, right? From no formal organization of national defense information in the late 19th century to a present day behemoth. It's a system that's intimidating and opaque, but secrecy still plays a very prominent role, right, in political and cultural life. Disclosures, whether they're real, whether they are imagined or even fictional, are central to shaping public understanding of American secrecy. Now, much of our knowledge comes from about the system comes via leaks from people inside or the press. But fiction is especially important, I think, and especially effective in filling in the vast blanks. Secrecy is a staple of popular entertainment, TV series, things like X-Files, House of Cards, Homeland, it's part of video games. Hollywood, of course, has a very rich tradition of producing political thrillers and dramas about why the government shouldn't be trusted, right? From the height of Cold War McCarthyite paranoia in Nigeria and Canada to the Watergate scandal, right, in All the President's Men, to the conspiracies around the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. We were talking with some undergrads earlier today about JFK actually having a really important catalytic effect in terms of release of information. More public information around a topic came about because of this film than the efforts of scholars, researchers, or any sort of sense of citizens' rights. So you have that, the pervasiveness of secrecy is also felt, I think, in contemporary political debates, right? Especially online social media spaces where conspiracy theories and deep state fears are quite rife. QAnon, InfoWars, disinfo media. In short, the spectre of secrecy is woven into the fabric of American society. But where does this system come from? Now, the origins of what's termed national defense information was rooted in the late 19th century. Early attempts to secure miscellaneous defense information in the Republic centers on press regulation, right? Asking the press not to publish certain things, and for the last part, they go along with it. But there is a shift in focus at the turn of the 20th century, with an attempt to control information within the federal government. And a lot of this is tied to the emergence of the US on the world stage, on the assertion of power of much more assertive United States in the world that's seeking to organize these nascent secrets that it's dealing with, right? Especially information that it holds in these newfound military bases, territories, and colonies, thinking particularly about places like Panama, the Philippines, and various other areas in the Pacific, right? All of these new spaces of American imperial control, the information that's held there, how do you secure it, right? You have some Americans, but you also have many non-Americans who are working in these spaces, in these bases, in these consulates. So how do you do that? The Constitution means that the US cannot have an official secrets act, like you have in the UK and many other countries, right? And that's largely because of First Amendment speech rights. Instead, you have a loose legal platform that's erected through, firstly, the Defence Secrets Act in 1911, which actually borrows heavily from the British secrecy laws in order to protect sensitive information, primarily by criminalizing disclosures. So many of the provisions that come through this Defence Secrets Act are rolled over into the more famous Espionage Act of 1970, which remains even to the present day the keystone legislation that underpins the secrecy regime. Okay? And it's worth pausing to reflect on what this is, the Espionage Act, right? A World War I era law to police dissent, which develops into a key tool to police nascent secrets. And it's the Woodrow Wilson administration that plays a key role in this, right? So Wilson, during the war, asked Congress to protect confidential government information. Wartime, and one of the earliest proposals that's put forward essentially rests all authority in the presidency, right? The president has the right to define what secret is, and will have all control over national security information and the distribution of that. And unsurprisingly, Congress and the press kick up a real fuss. There's a lot of pushback. The press arguably more so than Congress. Eventually, a form is passed, which becomes the Espionage Act, and there's a central compromise here, where the state can keep secrets, but the press is able to publish them if they obtain them. Okay. Now, the Espionage Act was flawed legislation on a number of levels, and there have been a number of important legal studies that have suggested that many in Congress didn't even know what it was that they were voting on, but what they were agreeing to. But moreover, it left a crucial unresolved issue at the heart of what it was that we're talking about when it comes to secrets, right? Because it was now illegal to expose secrets, but there was no definition as to what counted as a secret and who could handle it. Okay? So illegal to disclose them, but there's no clear explanation as to what secrets and who could disseminate them. And this ambiguity foils government attempts to prosecute a number of disclosures during the 1930s and also during the 1940s, including during the war. This includes a book by an American code breaker, the cryptologist Herbert Yardley, publishes about his experiences. And it also allows newspapers like the Chicago Tribune to publish wartime military plans and not be so prosecuted. Now, it's not until the early years of the Cold War, when there's amplified concern about Soviet espionage and safeguarding atomic secrets, that this issue is clarified. Right? And it's the Truman and Eisenhower administrations who establish what we know as the modern classification system today. Right? So a series of executive orders, a system to safeguard information from unauthorized disclosure, is created to uphold US national security. So Truman, Eisenhower, a couple of executive orders in 1951, 1953, create the categories for documents. So you have these, each document has to be stamped, and the three categories are those here: confidential, secret, top secret. There was initially a fourth one, restricted data information, but Eisenhower executive order removes that, and it's three. And equally importantly, these executive orders establish the rules for the handling of these documents. Okay. Now, every successive president, every administration has sort of tinkered with it, passing their own executive orders, but the fundamental structure remains the same. It's the one that was set up by Harry the Ninth, right? Remains the same today. And if there are any master students who are looking to do an essay or a dissertation, there is still, I've yet to read a really good work that analyze these executive orders. So for anyone interested, look them up, the executive orders, 10-290, 10-501, and then you can also enjoy a nice ride on the Truman Eisenhower Memorial Highway to go and research these. There's one exception here, and that's, of course, atomic information, right? This is the exception. It stands apart. It's in a different self-contained space, right? The information related to atomic weapons are born secret, restricted data, it's called, and that's rooted in the Atomic Energy Act. There was a good book that came out last year by Wallerstein that talks about this. Now, what's particularly interesting in terms of the secrecy regime is the judicial rationale that Truman and Eisenhower used to justify this classification system. Right? Both of them cite, the authority vested in me by the Constitution and statutes and as President of the United States, end quote, when they're passing their executive orders. Okay. There's a couple of things to unpack here. The statute that's referenced was, of course, the Espionage Act, but the Espionage Act only outlined the penalties for disclosing information, fines, prison terms. The classification system that emerges in the 50s plugs the hole from the 1917 debate around the Espionage Act regarding the definition of secrets. In other words, the criminal law enforcement preceded the rules about secrecy itself. The sentence comes before it was clear what the crime was. The other issue relates to constitutional authority. That's a reference to the president, of course, as the commander-in-chief, responsible for the nation's defense. But this is a very generous reading of presidential authority. There's nothing in the Constitution, of course, about state secrets. And we can consider this as part of this broader trend that Arthur Schlesinger, of course, termed the rise of the modern imperial presidency. This all, I think, points to two crucial issues here. Firstly, secrecy is an executive project. Right? Secrets are the domain of the executive branch. The rules on classification, on access, all come through executive orders. Congress doesn't have a say, let alone the public. Executive orders, of course, don't appear in the Constitution anywhere. They're not rooted in statute. They are essentially presidential proclamations that are de facto rules as soon as they're signed. As such, when it comes to secrecy, the public interest is defined by the executive. Okay? It's why a lot of the literature, particularly political science and within law, the discussion is about, what's the appropriate line? Where do we draw the line between security and liberty? Why a lot of that research, a lot of that scholarship, I think, is problematic. Because the terms and the framework are set by those who created the system and who are in charge. And I think that's why a historical approach is so important to discussing this issue. The second point I'm flagging is that ever since the 50s, there have been periodic political events around the amount of classification, right? There is a system of overclassification, a culture of overclassification in the US government. So again, ever since the system was created, there have been laments about this issue, but nothing's ever been done that has tackled the problem. Right? And the crux of the issue is that there's no motive for those who work in the system to not classify. Right? There's no risks to overclassifying, with lots of risks to underclassifying. In fact, Daniel Patrick Moynihan in his commission report noted that, and I quote, "For the grunts, the rule is stamp, stamp, stamp." Right? So it's very quotidian, it's every day. was interviewing a national security official as part of the whistleblowing book that Jay mentioned at the outset. And he recounted this story about how he was working in security, in one of the security agencies, and a very everyday kind of thing that would happen both for him and many of his colleagues was they would make lunch plans with friends, with spouses, other people who worked there, send an email, where do you want to go for lunch, send, you have to classify that. Any kind of communication has to be made, so keep it secret. And then they would reply, it's going to KFC, send, classified, right? Why do they do that? Why not? That's what everybody does, right? You have to classify, you have to label this information, right? Amusing story, but it points, I think, to a bigger issue, right? We often think of secrets as a nuclear secret, code, something that will provide insight into a hidden, a truth that's being hidden from us. But the reality is much of secrecy is very quotidian, it's very everyday, it's very dull, right? It doesn't need to be secret, okay? And that's the nature of the classification system. So the system is created, set up in the 50s, but it doesn't take long before formally classified documents and information start appearing in the public sphere, right? Primarily via the press and also by government insiders. And indeed, the seminal exposures from this era, from the 50s through to the 70s, involve American officials who were working inside the national security state. Indeed, the first attempted Espionage Act prosecution for leaking secrets comes in 1956, and there's this guy in the top left here, John Nickerson, the US Army, who passes classified information to the press, and it's related to internal Defense Department disputes about missile programs. When Nickerson's at the trial, he says, "My only crime is loving the army too much." But it's not until the 70s when the cracks in the secrecy regime become widest. Right? You have a series of exposures of secret US government activities both at home and also abroad. And these are based on exposures by the press, whistleblowers. All of which comes in the context of collapsing Cold War consensus, right? Before that, Vietnam, Watergate, social upheavals, civil rights struggles. And the most famous example is probably Daniel Ellsberg's leaking of the Pentagon Papers. Top secret study of US decision-making in the Vietnam War, right? The Pentagon Papers case is seminal in the evolution of the secrecy regime. Through two prominent legal trials, one which is against the press, and the other one which is against Ellsberg, and his co-conspirator, who helps him reproduce the documents. Now, the press, of course, win a very famous victory, as the Supreme Court rules that the US government could not invoke the Espionage Act to censor publications of Pentagon Papers. They couldn't be prior restraint of the press. The case against Ellsberg, however, is more interesting, but it was left hanging because his trial for violating the Espionage Act was dismissed. Right? It's kicked out not because of the legal basis of the case, but due to the shenanigans of Nixon's plumbers unit. Right? The plumbers unit that's set up in the White House to plug the leaks, the likes of Ellsberg. Right? As we all know, these plumbers then go on to bungle the burglary of Watergate, and it leads to Nixon's resignation. So the Ellsberg case is probably the most famous one. We also have a lot of books, a series of books by former CIA officials, covert warriors, who make startling revelations about the secret wars that are being waged abroad. We also have a new generation of investigative journalists, reporter who's chipping away at the secrecy regime on a very daily basis, right? Including famous figures like Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post, Daniel Shaw, Jack Anderson at the New York Times, Seymour Hersh, and Neil Sheehan at the New York Times. Daniel Shaw and Jack Anderson who have syndicated columns around the US. Now, collectively, these very diverse forms of disclosure provide an unprecedented insight into the workings of the national security state and into information that is categorized as off limits to the public. And these revelations contribute to calls for greater accountability. And there are some notable achievements. Right? You have the bolstering of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, you have the passing of the sunshine laws that mandate federal government transparency, and Congress is strengthening with regard to oversight of intelligence agencies. But the 1970s is not an era of great transparency with regard to state secrets. Right? Exceptions are made for national security information with respect to FOIA and the sunshine laws, and executive authorities are more determined to reinforce secrecy. And reinforcing how this is very much an issue that cuts across party politics. You have contrasting Democratic and Republican presidential administrations, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, who are all part of this drive to introduce new rules and stiffer penalties for disclosure. So, in the wake of the collapse of the Ellsberg trial, the US government shifts its approach from one which is reactive to one which is much more proactive with regard to exposures, right? They resolve, in short, to nip the problem in the bud before it can bloom outside of the national security state, forcing them to fight about issues of secrecy in the public realm, okay? Try to control it within. And there's a number of cases that are seminal here. I'm going to mention one of them today, of how a response to exposures around by whistleblowers has wider ramifications for the secrecy regime and leads to prior restraint of all US government officials who deal with this. And the case involves this guy on the left here, Victor Marchetti, former CIA official. There's no reason why you would know about him, not unless you're a fan of really bad intelligence spy fiction. There's maybe some people there who like that. If you do, if that's your thing, check out his book, Road Dancer. You can buy it for like 2 cents online. It's not very good. So this is a former CIA official, writes this novel about the ills of a fictional national intelligence agency, right? So he publishes this book, and in the preceding years, or the years afterwards, sorry, he gives a number of critical press interviews and talks about writing yet more fiction. This spooks Nixon's administration, who put him under surveillance. And as they're surveying him, they find out that Marchetti is planning to write a book about his actual experiences in government. So what they do is they bring a permanent injunction against him, right? It's appealed, but it's upheld in the Court of Appeals. Right? And this ruling orders Marchetti to submit all of his writing, future writing, to the CIA before it's published. Okay? To do so, to justify it, they cite the secrecy agreement, right? The non-disclosure agreement that Marchetti had signed when he joined the CIA. And because of that, the judge rules that the case stands outside the scope of the First Amendment. And the question was not that Marchetti had revealed state secrets or any classified information. Marchetti hadn't even written a book yet, it was just an idea in his head. But the issue was about the potential to disclose secrets. It tied this secrecy contract that everybody who works in government signs when they join, which is an executive branch employment contract, essentially, right? It ties it to the espionage statutes, those laws from the World War I era, and also by the National Security Act of 1947. Okay? Now, initially, this ruling only affects CIA officials. You have the creation of the Pre-Publication Review Board. All CIA officials have to submit things to that body before anybody talks publicly. But by the 1980s, this rule, this secrecy agreement, is rolled out across the entire executive branch, across all agencies. Anybody who comes across potentially classified information, any congressional inquiries, any staffer who works on these inquiries, any official who could come into contact with this. Right? And this has affected scholars as well, historians, prominent ones, people like, some of you may be familiar with people like Richard Immerman, the late Bob Jervis, anybody who's had a role in government services in some shape or form will have to sign these secrecy agreements and have their future writing clear before they can publish. And any violation could lead to prosecution. Again, any public writing, speeches, presentations, they have to be clear. In short, prior restraint of national security officials, both past and present, was permissible. First Amendment rights were essentially suspended when it came to state secrets. Now, there are two other incidents which are seminal, but this one was, I think, particularly pertinent. It contributes to this period, this emergence during the 70s and the 80s, of a deeper culture of secrecy that involves more state secrets, growing numbers of people who handle them, hostility towards transparency, and harsher censorship or exposure. Which brings us back to Moynihan. The end of the Cold War provides an opportunity to reassess this relationship between secrecy and security. And Moynihan launches the most prominent challenge, both as a lawmaker and as a scholar, an attempt to change the debate about government secrets. The Moynihan Commission does work at the middle of the decade, produces its report in 1977, outlines several very moderate proposals. It proposes a number of things, including life cycle for secrets, a national declassification center, and legislation. It proposes a statute to establish what can be declared a secret, so taking the issue out of the hands of the executive branch. All of these are, fairly moderate, inside the beltway kind of ideas. They're not radical. It's not calling for an overhaul of the system. But it represented a significant check on how secrecy, or how the secrecy regime functioned. And the fact that his efforts had no meaningful impact was a telling reflection of how ingrained state secrets and state secrecy had become. So this is coming in the late 1990s, the report from 1997, he writes a book which is based on an appendix of that report, Secrecy 1998. Is moving to the early 21st century. Any hope of curbing secrecy is evaporated, of course, by 9/11 terrorist attacks and the subsequent global war on terror. Alongside the rapid expansion of executive power comes heightened levels of secrecy. And it was no surprise that you see a new wave of exposures in response to the conflicts of the period. You have a new generation of journalists, whistleblower, activists, who's looking to reveal information that the state classifies and considers out of the purview of the public sphere. And there's a number of cases, a number of headlines. I'm sure many of us are familiar with these, with the individuals who are involved. Many of the press stories that come out, the headlines around secrecy emphasizes the sense of drama. Right? Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, reality winner Julian Assange, James Comey, or Trump, right? The documents at Mar-a-Lago right now, the unfolding case. The coverage often dwells on the individual, on the drama, but doesn't explain the system or how we got to this point here. So, the time for the answers for our quiz. So, who would like to hazard a guess as to which one is the odd one out? Yeah.
Reality winner because she was punished for leaking state secrets.
I thought first time out. Wow, fantastic. There we go. Yeah, excellent. Right. I thought there'd be like the TV show, people go to houses, they can't figure it out. You see, they've got a sharp plan. Right. So yes, it's reality winner. All of them have been accused of violating the rules of secrecy, the secrecy regime, but it's only the winner who is ever charged and serves prison term, right? New York Times, of course, 1971, accused of violating the Espionage Act as part of the Pentagon Papers trial. The Supreme Court rules in favor of it. David Petraeus is investigated for sharing classified information with his biographer, also happens to be his lover in 2015. Eventually, he's subject to lower charges and doesn't serve any kind of prison term. And then, of course, Donald Trump, who's accused of having classified information at Mar-a-Lago, and there are some arguments that he could have violated the Espionage Act. Unfolding case, I'll be surprised if he does. But then, of course, reality winner, the only one who who is charged under the Espionage Act, reveals information around Russian interference in the 2016 election. And she served a term in prison and just was released not that long ago, 3 years for doing so. So, to wrap up, state secrecy may be commonplace, may be assumed to have been around forever, but they haven't. Okay? The secrecy regime should not be taken for granted. It's not permanent, it was created. Right? The system has been defined by improvisation and reaction. It's developed in an ad hoc fashion, often in response to disclosures, rather than a clear sense of what constitutes a secret and why information should be secured. It's grown exponentially since the early 20th century, with an ideological commitment to keeping information out of the public sphere in the name of national security. And for anyone looking to rethink secrecy, I think that's a very useful place to begin. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time for questions, and as is custom, we'd like to begin with a question from one of our students.
So you mentioned that you had a background in Italy during the Cold War as a dual citizen there, so that's very close to my heart. I wonder if you could talk about the American Intelligence Service's involvement there, specifically around the kidnapping and death of Prime Minister Aldo Moro. There's a mood amongst some Italians that the CIA may very well had a hand in his disappearance because of his compromise with the Communist Party in Parliament.
Okay. All right, the Italian angle already coming in. I wasn't expecting that. So the Italian security system and the Italian security services have, more than most Western European countries, been heavily influenced by the United States. And this has led to a plethora of accusations, assumptions that they are the tool of the CIA, FBI. There are a lot of people who earned a living in the 70s and the 80s writing books about this sort of stuff. The Aldo Moro case, for those of you not familiar, Aldo Moro, former prime minister, he was kidnapped by the Red Brigade. He was like a Marxist terrorist organization. He was later found assassinated in the centre of Rome. And there were accusations that the CIA were part of this, as well as Masonic lodges, P2, Vatican, all of these kind of things. I don't know the ins and outs. I haven't followed it closely, but I suspect that there is very tangential links to the CIA. But I think it speaks to a broader question, an issue of, again, the cult of secrecy within modern democracies, right? Even right now, probably the only country, one that's close to my heart, Italy has probably a more dysfunctional political system than the UK at the moment. There's its own political crisis. But secrecy plays a role within political debate. Again, this idea that the government can be trusted, that there are influences behind the scene, that are pulling the strings, there's making things tick and work. It's alluring, right? It's interesting. It grabs attention, but I think it takes away from the fundamental issue of the problems of the democratic order in these countries, and sort of the need for political parties to step up and actually meet the needs.
Yeah. So, talking about the Espionage Act, do you think it's outdated, or what would it look like if we updated it today? Speaking with the fact that we don't know how much classified information that the government currently has.
The short answer is yes, it probably should. I mean, this is a statute which is over 100 years old. It was not created with secrecy in mind. There's a good friend of mine who's writing a book on the Espionage Act, like a narrative history of it. So I'm waiting for him to produce his conclusion because he's got a number of policy proposals. I was sort of chicken out when it comes to how should we change the system. I just claim I'm a historian. I do the backstory. I'll leave it to other people to project forward. Whether there would be change, I doubt. Just because the system is so jerry-rigged, you remove that, a lot of other things would collapse. you would have to start from scratch. Well, this issue came up earlier when we were talking with some of the undergrads. It would require so much buy-in from presidency and administration, Congress. There would also have to be a push from civil society to want a change. I just don't think that that's a prominent issue right now, and I can't see it becoming or coming to the forefront of political priority.
This might be kind of along the same vein. You mentioned Edward Snowden just briefly earlier. A new dimension to the debate as to whether he's a patriot or a traitor has been added ever since he's been granted Russian citizenship very recently. So I know you just say you don't like to speculate onto the future of things, but where do you see the conversation surrounding whistleblowers in the United States going in the future with this news kind of in mind?
All right, I'm getting back over all my old books here. This is good. So the Snowden case. So for those, if you haven't been following, Snowden recently was granted Russian citizenship, and the way he explained it was that it was to ensure his family was get together with his wife his days, got 2 kids, I think. This is a guy who doesn't have a passport, because the reason why he's in Russia is because the US government revoked his passport while he was attempting to travel to Latin America. So he was in transit in Moscow. So he lacked a travel document, that's the passport, and that's why he ended up staying. It muddies the waters. I suspect Putin did that to put the US and the West in a tricky position, right, in the context of the Ukraine conflict. With regards to whistleblowing going forward, I mean, we focus again on the individuals like this Snowden, but the most salient point, I think, on the contents of the revelations and what that did. And it had a lot of political impact, right? Congress discussed and changed the rules around what the security infrastructure could do in terms of surveying American citizens. Not so much what CIA and NSA could do abroad, but within the US there were more restrictions brought in. So the emphasis on Snowden, I think, detracts from the more important political points. Where it goes going forward, I think the more interesting developments are around financial whistleblowing, corporate whistleblowing. Think about things like Panama Papers, offshore accounts, whistleblowers out of social media companies talking about how these companies use algorithms, etc. And I think the developments in those areas are probably more interesting to keep an eye on than national security.
Yeah, thank you for a most fascinating talk. I'd like to come back to your question of the roots of all this. I think the national security culture is very important to look at, and to look at the entrepreneurs of fear and threat scenarios. And I think that should be mentioned more in terms of who's in charge, whose interest is represented in these agencies. And as you know, these agencies are always competing to each other. And that is a business in itself. And I think World War I is the original root of all this. I mean, with the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act especially. And when you look at the roots, you see how coincidental it all appeared. There was, Gregory was there, the Attorney General, and he looked up at the Espionage Act. He found it then in the 18th century. So I was wondering if this dynamic development can be better explained with a cultural setting and the business orientation. The fear entrepreneurs we have to raise the fear level in order to get more money, more funds in. So I was just, looking at this angle, and perhaps you can expand this a little bit more, how the secrecy culture developed and who's interested in this. What social groups are interested in that, and how much money they're making and how much political benefits they have.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. For the early part of the 20th century, particularly this period between World War I and World War II, the idea of the fear of the leaking of information to foreign spies, to subversives within, is very, very significant. As we all know, during the 1930s, the number of the books that come out that talk about sort of the profiteering that goes on during World War I. It's quite prominent, plays a key role, as we know, in terms of World War II and the America First movement. I think the issue really comes to a head in the World War II early Cold War period, when you've got the mobilization of national security officials who want to ensure that the US is on the front foot in terms of the Cold War, to ensure that the US does not retreat in any kind of shape or form, that it projects its power into the world. And to do that, you need strong national security agencies. So I think the culture is really important. But the culture also affects the debate around the creation of institutions. And I'm not one of those historians that says you have to just look at the institutions. But I think tracing that story, particularly over the latter part of the 20th century, is kind of interesting to help us give better definition to this. But I think you're absolutely right. The culture of secrecy is the one that allows all of us, the public, to access.
Okay, Grant's been dying to go.
So you've mentioned the executive branch and Congress. I was just curious how the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Courts in 1978, kind of the role that that's played, and where you see what some are considering the most powerful branch of government, or starting to be really come into changing themselves into the most powerful branch of government, where the judicial branch kind of fits in the big macro picture of all this.
Yeah, so the Pfizer court's a good example, I think, of this exact phenomenon. The executive course always has a wide scope to define what is the national interest. It's historically the legislative and the judicial branches have supported it. There's been some occasional moments where there's been kickbacks, the 70s being one, but in very focused ways, like oversight of the CIA operating home, right? What the FBI are doing in terms of violating constitutional rights. But on the whole, the judicial and legislative branches have been supporting the executive, I think, in terms of the secrecy regime more generally. Right? So when you move to the late 70s and early 80s, things like the rules that were brought in for Marchetti, there are a number of other officials. The Supreme Court passes some really important decisions. One of them is against another CIA official, a guy called Frank Sneck, who releases a book but doesn't get it checked by the CIA before, doesn't go through this pre-publication review. It doesn't reveal any secrets. So what can the state do? So they argue that this official is profiteering, making money on from their experiences. They may not be revealing secrets, but they're profiteering. So it's a landmark Supreme Court case, and it's one which comes up again and again. Snowden is accused of violating it. John Bolton is accused of violating it, right? So it goes back to this issue of how the politics, you've got to strip it out because it affects so many different people, characters. So it's just one example of how, aside from a couple of moments, generally the judicial branches have supported the executive secrecy project.
Yeah, so I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about the start of the talk. I see this development over the 20th century, but just kind of story that you tell about what predates it was one of the surprising things in the 18th century. Because when I think of the 18th century, I think of it as an expansion of bureaucracy and obsession with secrecy. So people might not have stamps, but they're writing it secret or very secret, and there is a kind of codified system. The French, the British empires, the Americans were created as well. And I think too, like the specter of secrecy that you talk about, the sense of state conspiracy, is really essential things like the revolutionary period from the Hutchinson brothers to kind of the first diplomatic departments of the secret committee. Secret's really foundational. I think Caitlin Carter's work too, which is all about, she's at Notre Dame in this book, House of Glass, but it's all about how issues over secrecy are so foundational to the creation of democratic politics in this kind of major revolutionary period. And so to me, it seems really different, right? It's just the sheer size of the bureaucracy, and the fact that it becomes so codified, the way they're doing it. I'm trying to figure out if this really is something that should be seen as an ethical, really expecting in government setup, or if it's more that in the 20th century, just the bureaucracy is so much bigger than what's.
Yeah, I need to dig back a little bit further, like, sort of, how I pitched the book, the publisher probably wouldn't be pleased. So I'm going back even further there. Already like, I'm into the late 19th century, and I'm like, oh, can you keep it short? But I think you're right. I mean, there is always a deeper history there. You're right. I think it's the codification of that, right? As you start to develop the formal structures to organize this information. It's funny, I was thinking with some colleagues the other day about sort of the British secrecy regime, which is going through a lot of changes. And so much of that is based on that old boys network, the idea of good chaps, that they'll do the right thing. And I think there's an element of that which extends across the British, French, probably the American one as well, right? The idea that you've got good, upstanding people who are working in these bureaucracies, who are exchanging information, and that upstanding citizens, they will do the right thing. So you don't necessarily have to have too many rules, you don't have to have too many regulations to protect secrets. And then, of course, the other issue is just the projection of power, I think, that accompanies the story in the 20th century. As you go abroad, as you've got these facilities that are no longer inside the United States. But I pick your brains on the 18th century. So.
It's probably one of the many apocryphal Disraeli quotes, but I dimly recall that Disraeli said, in Westminster, a secret is something you tell one person at a time. Little chaps. Chris.
I really appreciate your institutional look at this issue. And it got me thinking, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, other institutional attempts at secrecy, maybe not state, but corporate secrecy. The recency I read some reporting on how Seymour Hersh tried to do what he did with My Lai, but in a corporate setting in the 70s, and he got so swamped that he retreated because the corporate ability to defend secrets was so profound that it was impossible for him to recreate what he was able to do with the military, when what the military did was so disgusting, and the weight of the event was so atrocious. It was easier to bust the state secrecy regime. But I know my own work in 20th century history, I can only go so far in corporate history because the wall is so severe. And I was wondering if your work has ever touched on, or is expecting to touch on the transfer of approaches of regimes of secrecy or recreating it in different contexts. I think that would relate to corporate America doing it kind of better in some ways.
In short, no, but I do know that there are a couple of scholars who are working on this issue, particularly around intellectual property and patents in the early part of the 20th century. And it's around sort of military hardware, like the technology that comes out of submarine warfare, that sort of stuff, like early kinds of machine learning that you have in the early part of the 20th century. So there are people who are sort of working on this. KFC is doing some good work on this. It's not a core part of my project. There are some interesting, I think, corporate overlaps in terms of employment law when it comes to the secrecy agreements, because they take that from contract law world rather than constitutional law. And I think that's where the issues come together once again.
Okay, we got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how the formal legal apparatus around secrecy interacts with the informal norms of the press. Because the government officials for a while in the mid-20th century could count on a lot more deference from the press, especially vis-a-vis their private lives, that FDR, J. Edgar Hoover, JFK could count on their sex lives not being published for the most part, and that deference is no longer available from the press. And more generally, after people like Woodward and Bernstein become heroes, there's a whole different attitude in the press toward government officials. So how much legal change is driven by the collapse of what didn't used to have to be codified because the head of the FBI or the president could call up the publisher of the New York Times and say, you're not going to talk about this, right?
Of course, yeah. I think you have a bigger press call in many ways, even though the press has been has undergone a big change in the United States, right? Much less diversity, but within these institutions and within the new media spaces, I think there are some more voices that come before. I always think that there's a great book called The Georgetown Set. If you come across this, the author's name escapes me now, but it talks about these social settings in the Washington suburb of Georgetown, right, where the government officials, press publishers, the journalists would have these long boozy evenings and dinners where they would be talking about what was appropriate to discuss. Like that kind of close press state relationship starts to break down in the 60s. All of those informal codes are harder to uphold. Right? You've got new generations that are coming through, like some of the folks that here will be shown. I think there is a big cultural shift that takes place in the 1960s. That's not to say that the close state press relationship goes away. I mean, there are a number of examples during just the last, even the 21st century, right? The number of journalists who were, let's say, embedded within troops or combat missions within Iraq and Afghanistan, a number of journalists who were very close to the Bush White House, thinking particularly of Judith Miller, who propagated what was the key sort of journalist talking about weapons of mass destruction. People who so I mean, I think that phenomenon still exists. You've just got more voices and more voices with mediums with which to communicate with. Right? Before, unless it was in the New York Times or the Washington Post, chances are it's not going to reach a national audience. Now you have there are other ways in which you can reach people. And I think that's a shift that starts in the 70s and obviously accelerates with the digital revolution.
So I wanted to speak to the relationship of the Freedom of Information Act to the secrecy states, because on the one hand, it looks like a weapon against it, but is it really like a legitimating tool for the secrecy state? I don't know the history of this information, but it seems like it could serve that function. I have a friend who does intelligence studies. He has to sue for the Freedom of Information Act for the most frivolous possible document you could imagine in this. But it is some to it. And I'm wondering how potent it is, and I'm wondering what you see its function.
Yeah, and so the Freedom of Information Act goes back a little bit further. Its origins are also in the 50s. It's bolstered in the 60s. In fact, again, something we were talking about a little bit earlier, but one of the chief sort of proponents of bolstering it is Ronald Rumsfeld. Right? So again, we're talking about Secretary of Defense Bush, of course. The political issues and lines become quite blurred. You have Rumsfeld, who's a big proponent. So the Freedom of Information Act, of course, allows people to request government information. But there are so many exceptions with regard to national security information, it's not an effective tool. And there have been a number of law sort of scholars, people like David Posen, who've written on the troubling transparency and the amount of weight we put into these tools, which are quite imperfect. More likely, so in the Eisenhower Library this week, there's a number of classified documents that I was trying to get hold of. You can't use the Freedom of Information Act. You need to file what's called mandatory declassification with an MDR. Very long process. That is the one which, as researchers, as members of the public, that we would have to file to get hold of or to gain access to things. Freedom of Information Act is more around the non-security elements of the government. You know, they're better than nothing, but they're not perfect tools. They're not a way to exercise accountability or to insist on accountability transparency. It's not a suitable tool for ensuring the right to know. So,
Okay, last question, I saw a hand back there. Yeah.
You spoke towards the incentive structures in the Wilson through sort of Eisenhower era of foreign influence both on and off American soil, right, which led to the necessary creation of this culture of secrecy. Then the cases that you talked about here were largely either they were leaks due to either perceived public interest or for profits, right, but not necessarily for like a foreign interest. Could you speak maybe towards the perpetuation of those foreign interests in regards to America that might necessitate the perpetuation of that culture of secrecy?
so there are a number of cases that are prominent in the interwar period, including some dual nationals. You have some Germans who are based in the US who are charged under the Espionage Act, or they're never prosecuted, but the Espionage Act is cited. And they are essentially passing information back to the German government, right? They're collecting information which is all public. Right? A lot of it is defense, sort of open information that you find in trade journals, in newspapers, statistics, that sort of stuff, which goes back to that dilemma that's open up in the Espionage Act. Right? It's illegal to share secrets, but it's not clear what a secret is. So that's why there's a number of cases within that interwar period that speak to this question, and that's why the executive orders of Truman and Eisenhower are important for the closing that loophole. So I think that's an interesting period. After that, the focus very much turns to controlling the information within the bureaucracy, which is why all the prominent cases are from that point on American national security officials.
Okay, before we put our hands together to thank Nathan, it behooves me to say that until his book is published on this topic, this is all classified.
You cannot confirm nor deny.
So let's give him a big warm thank you. Here, same time, same place, next Friday for Andy Hammond's lectures. We look forward to that. Please join us. I think we've got more.
Jay, you also announced the Thursday program next week with the J School with Major Guerra.
Yes. There's a Thursday with the journalism school. We are friendly co-sponsors, but we're not organizing that one. But that's definitely going to be worth going. I think it's at 5:30. 5:30 next Thursday. But we will all definitely be here for Andy on Friday. All right, please join us for a reception up there. Peter. I mean, it's